Yesterday, I happened to be scrolling through Instagram and I ran across an ambient artist who was complaining about the fact that he had had a claim on one of the tracks that he had uploaded to his distributor. Now, apparently, it had gotten flagged as AI generated, and he was very upset about that. And his working theory was AI has been training on my music, on my tracks. And that very well may be the case. That's another issue entirely that we need to deal with at some point. But I have a different theory. Let's face it, a lot of ambient music is fairly low effort. And I can say that because I've made a lot of ambient music that's fairly low effort. And I think as ambient artists and musicians, if that's a genre that we're interested in, we have to kind of look at ourselves in the mirror and ask, what are we doing that sets our music apart from everything else, or from what a computer can make very quickly? Because, let's face it, computers are making ambient music very quickly. While it's fun to explore ambient soundscapes, I was a composer long before I got into music tech and synthesizers. So I've always had the idea that I wanted to make music that was well crafted and that was interesting for people to listen to. Beautiful to get them interested, but interesting enough that they stick around and they find that there's layers to it if they actively listen. So basically what I'm saying is I get bored very easily by a lot of ambient music, even as someone who loves synth pads and long reverb tails. And I do think that craftsmanship and ambient music can coexist. There are lots of great examples of that in the world. Now, disclaimer here. If you are a hobbyist and you just love having a modular synth and just patching it and making soundscapes that evolve all day long, you have no intention of putting that music out, you just look at it as therapy, that's great. And this video is not about you or for you. By all means, go ahead. That's wonderful. And some of you, go ahead and leave your angry comment about me being a gatekeeper, even though there are no gates to keep anymore. But if you do love electronic music and synthesizers and all the technology that comes with it, and you want to approach it like an artist or a composer, then you have to set yourself apart somehow from the endlessly looping, filter sweeping masses. So I'm just going to show you how I've approached it over the past decade that I've been making electronic music in the ambient genre and trying to infuse it with some of the skills and techniques that I learned from my study as a classical composer. And I'll give you some actionable ideas so that you can start to do it too. My primary secret: don't always start with the sounds. Start with the notes. As you may have noticed, I don't hate music technology. And I absolutely agree that starting with the sounds can inspire you to do interesting things, if you have an imagination. But I also don't want it to become a crutch for me creatively. I don't want to always have to rely on a sequencer or a sample or some external thing to generate my musical ideas. I still want to be able to come up with strong melodies, chord progressions, sequences, or just a strong musical motif that can stand on its own and be sort of agnostic to the instrument that I'm using to play it. I'm an organist also, so when I was first starting out composing, I was writing these organ pieces that utilized the massive sound of the organ and the long reverb tails that the rooms the organs are in happen to have. And my composition teacher warned me against relying or leaning into such a rich and full sound that was covering up a lot of mistakes that I was making compositionally. He said, get it right in black and white first. In other words, work things out at your piano or on a soft sound where you can actually hear what's happening, and don't get lost in the grandiose sound perfume of the room. So his point was, make it work in black and white, then you can color it knowing that it's strong. You can color it with orchestration, instrumentation. And at that point, it can handle pretty much anything that you throw at it. That's why I often turn everything off and just go right at my piano. I view that as like a palate cleanser. And what I found is when I do that and restrict myself to that constraint, it makes my electronic music better when I go back to the synthesizers or the DAW. That's why I think of my modular kind of like my duet partner. The most interesting thing is not necessarily what it's doing, it's how it inspires me to react to it or react against it as I play alongside of it. So that sort of sidesteps the issue that a lot of people getting into modular reach out, which is they're trying to build a whole arrangement inside their modular synth and just let it do everything. And that is difficult because then you get into like menu diving, trying to set up sequencers to create entire songs, entire tracks. And I hate all of that. That gets like more menu divey than working in a DAW. So my solution is just to set up an interesting loop. And I'll tell you how to make your sequences more interesting in a second. But I set up that loop and allow it to loop while I provide the structure around it by what I'm doing in reaction to it. If you think of your sequences in a blocked way, where you take all the notes and you stack them vertically on top of each other, you could think of it as outlining a series of chords, so your sequence could almost become like a chord progression. Be careful about dictating what key you're in if you plan to improvise underneath it, because it's going to limit what you're able to do. And then the thing that was supposed to be providing some sort of progression or some sort of form or structure is also going to feel locked in that same loop with your sequence. You really just have to be very conscientious of how the two things are working together, because that is what makes up the harmony of your track. Not one or the other. Like people think of melody and chords and bass lines as all being separate things, but they're not. And we're going to talk about that in more detail in a bit. Also, try not to begin and end the sequence in the same place. And if it's a looping chord progression, try not to end and begin on the same chord. My composition teacher used to call that telegraphing what's coming next. So you kind of spoil the repeat by hinting at it too soon, just like you would spoil a joke by hinting at the punchline too early. Zoom out and consider your loop's overall shape. Does it go up? Does it come down? Does it have a nice arc to it? Is it going somewhere? This is where knowing a little bit about classical repertoire or classical phrasing can come in really handy, because you have a lot of good examples of really good musical phrase shapes. Or does it stay centered? In other words, does it just kind of hover around one or two notes that it keeps coming back to? Because that's going to have a very strong effect. And if you want your sequence to provide like almost a melodic shape or melodic information, you want to avoid that. If you want to do more interesting things around your sequence, you might lean into that. So it's all about intent. But to have intent, we need to know the difference. We need to know that one thing is happening or the other, so that we can choose what we want. And if we are able to do that, that prevents a lot of frustration of not knowing why what we're doing isn't working. As I mentioned before, when I hear people talk about chord progressions or melodies or bass lines or sequences, it almost seems like they think that they are all completely divorced from one another, and so they end up trying to put these Legos together that don't fit, because like they're not even all Legos. Some of them are Lego blocks, some of them are like the old Connect blocks from the 90s that I used to have, some of them are Lincoln Logs. It's just a mess. And to avoid that, you have to realize that they are all connected to each other. All of them together make up the harmonic language of your piece, of your track. That's exactly why I started teaching a linear approach to composition, a linear approach to chord writing in particular, because you can easily see how these things are connected and how you can mine from material that you've already made to develop it into new material, and everything still feels coherent and focused. Now, the waltz that I'm writing for piano currently is a really good example of this, and how the melody and the harmony are intrinsically linked. They are one thing. When I change one, it changes the other. So this means I can create variations while keeping familiar material, and everything feels connected, and when I get to a new section, I can mine what I've already done and don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater and start over. How can you start to write this way? Well, you might notice in that waltz, most of the time, there are only 3 notes sounding at once, which might surprise you if you think, oh, there seems to be a lot happening. Well, it's actually, I'm doing less than you probably think. I'm doing more with less. So as an exercise, limit yourself to just 3 notes sounding at one time, 3 parts. And start with a major triad and just move 1 note at a time, stepwise. So either just half steps or whole steps. You'll quickly find that you get to very interesting new chords, interesting harmonies, very, very quickly. Now, once you have like a 4-chord progression, just doing that, or maybe 8 chords would be better so that you can get further out away from that initial chord, take that middle voice and transpose it up an octave or 2 octaves to get it out of the way. Make the middle part the top part, which kind of makes it feel like the melody then. You'll notice that none of these parts ever double any of the notes of the other parts. That keeps them all feeling strong and independent, and then we can do more with less, like I said. And we can clearly see how these all line up to create the verticals, to create the chords, and yet they are 3 independent parts, or independent melodic ideas. Each part starts to feel like a melody. Do you see what I mean? As another exercise, take that progression that you just did and apply the same principles that you applied to your sequence, to your loop. Don't end in the same place where you started. Make sure that you end on a different chord than you began. Now you have a more loopable chord progression. You have a loop that can be repeated without us getting sick of hearing it, because you don't spoil it, you don't come back to the same place over and over unintentionally. It's really all about intent and context, isn't it? By the way, if you want to see how you can implement this style of writing, I'm hosting a 4-day composition challenge live via Zoom. So you can join me and we will work through this process together, and I'll just give you exercises that get you immediately working in this way. If you can drag notes around in your DAW, MIDI notes, you can do this, no matter how much or how little experience you have. And if you do have more experience, you come too, because I think you're going to find some new inspiration and new ways of thinking about putting notes together. So daily Zoom masterclasses with me and a private community for support. You can click the link below for that if that sounds interesting to you. So hopefully you're starting to see what I meant at the beginning. But when you start with a few simple note-first ideas, then the entire process of development and arrangement becomes easier. Things don't feel so forced anymore. Sound design becomes just another method for variation. So you can color things in different ways, and once you have a strong loopable loop, then you can get a lot more mileage out of that thing, and people will not get sick of hearing it quite as quickly. Let's just be totally honest here. In ambient music, the sounds do a lot, and you don't need to have a ton of stuff going on. But if you have just one interesting musical idea that you've worked out the harmony and the melody, the sequence, and you put some intention into that, that's going to set you apart from the masses. That's going to make you more future-proof as AI takes over a lot of the low-effort stuff that people do. Because if you have that interesting musical idea to frame things around, everything starts to feel structured. And people like structure. When things become more structured, they become more memorable. And that is what will bring people back to your music again and again. When there's something beautiful enough to make them stop and interesting enough to make them stay. If you want to see a video about synth pads, which I happen to love as an ambient guy, and how I make them more interesting in my ambient music, you can watch this video right here.